Fallout Equestria. War Does Change. By Tom 117Z. Chapter 1. Prologue. The end of the world was not, as many predicted, the end of history. War. War never changes. Or at least that is how the saying goes. Once upon a time, in the magical land of Equestria, the ponies who inhabited the land thrived for 1,000 years under the guiding hoof of Princess Celestia, the alicorn who held dominion over the sun itself. As those 1,000 years came to a close, she was joined on the throne both by her returned younger sister and her adoptive niece, Princess Luna and Miamore Cadenza. Alongside them, standing tall and proud, were 6 bearers of harmony. But this was also an era of change and danger. The long-lasting peace began to be tested again and again. Nightmare Moon, the Lord of Chaos Discord, King Sombra, and one of the most notable groups, one who did not simply vanish forever post-defeat, were the Changelings. They had attacked Canterlot during a royal wedding, only to be repelled with great casualties inflicted upon the shapeshifters. Back to the Badlands they limped, awaiting another chance to come their way. The years following would bring forth a great technological renaissance in Equestria. New technologies brought about what was once thought to be the realm of science fiction and turned it into fact. Everything from magical energy weapons to domesticated robots in every home. But with these advancements, the need for fuel to power them increased, and the fuel for these marvels existed in only one place: Zebraca. And the zebras, fueled partially by their hatred for the one previously known as Nightmare Moon, lost their willingness to share. And war never changes. As Princess Celestia stepped away from the public light, Princess Luna brought forth the Bearers of Harmony and had them form the Ministries. And Twilight Sparkle, under the advisement of one who Luna trusted deeply, was given control over the Ministry of Arcane Sciences to further all studies in magic. She was a mare of many secrets, but among the earliest were the secret meetings conducted with her old foe, the Changelings. Deals were made, hooves were shaken, and the Changelings unexpectedly chose to align with Equestria against their enemy. Their magic would be experimented on by the Ministry of Arcane Sciences, their infiltrators used to counter the Zebra Zone, all in return for a hive within Equestria's borders, and as much love energy as they could ever want. Twilight worked without rest to bring an end to the war, utilizing the resources of both Equestria and the Changelings to that effect. But she failed. And on one fateful day, balefire rained down from the sky, bringing an end to the world as it was once known. And the Equestrian Hive was never heard from again. Chapter 2. Introductory. Each journey begins with a single step. Brown. I don't really know why it still bothers me so much. The sky had been nothing but the same dreary brown clouds ever since the day I was born. The Pegasi upstairs not overly keen on sharing the goddess's sun. It was no different on that admittedly dull morning in New Appaloosa, with very little sunlight breaking through to brighten up the small town made up largely of various train pieces. If only someone could create a large, colorful mural to brighten the sky up. Or at least kick out the stick-up-their-own-asses enclave and clear things up a little. But wish as I might, I didn't see that happening anytime soon. With those depressing thoughts over, I lit up my horn and let my pale white aura bring over a checklist from the wagon I was hauling behind me. I was in this shithole of a town for one very specific reason, and those were caps. There was a mayor, a ghoul of all things, who was always interested in buying whatever random pieces of junk a scavenger like me might bring in. I let go of my magic and held the checklist in my brown-coated hoof. Just my fucking luck I got a coat as brown as the sky, and a mane a slight shade darker. At least my green eyes gave me some variety, not like any pony gave a damn. I was just some other scavenger coming to see Ditzy do, the wagon and cutie mark depicting a pile of scrap being a small giveaway. My parents, who were long since raider bait, even had the decency to give their little colt a name like Scrap Heap. I really was cursed from birth, wasn't I? Ignoring that, I looked at the name of the shop I was heading towards. Absolutely Everything was its name. Suitable, since that's pretty much exactly what the owner sold. You wanted something in New Appaloosa, you went to Ditzy-Do. I'd met Ditzy a few times previously, since she was always the one to buy my wares whenever I frequented the town. The ghoul was pleasant enough, and always eager to part with her caps for whatever piece of junk you may present her. Saying that, though, she had her eccentricities. Seriously, how can any pony in the wasteland be that damn bubbly? You'd think living 200 years in a decaying world would turn you feral like most other ghouls, but not Ditzy. Somehow that mare just keeps on trucking along, come what may. I suppose I have to respect that, despite her clumsiness. It has to take a serious force of will to stay sane for so long. Or maybe she's just that oblivious, but what do I know? I trotted slowly past the various ponies of the town, each one shooting me the odd, wary glance. I suppose they had a right to their wariness. Trust isn't a common or necessarily wise thing in the wastes of Equestria, and some scavengers can be as mean as any raider given half the chance, especially if you encroach upon their salvage. Fuck that shit. Who would shoot a pony for a piece of scrap metal? Nevertheless, they all moved on after sneaking their looks. They all had somewhere to be, whether that be helping keep the town afloat, or simply heading towards the bottle and a future headache. Whatever those ponies wished to do, I just pulled up outside absolutely everything and brought the wagon to a stop. I wrapped my magic around the harness and unhitched myself from the wagon, casting them aside and turning to take inventory. I had a pretty good idea from previous experience how much Ditzy would pay for each separate piece and certain ways to haggle the price up. Too bad I was out of muffins. Not that I'd ever had one in the first place, but if I ever did, I knew exactly where I would take them. Content with my haul and the caps soon to line my pockets, I turned from the wagon and walked briskly into the building behind me. Like everything else, it was cobbled together. But having accommodation at all was a gift nowadays. Wish I had a house. Maybe someday. The inside of the shop was a disaster area. Pieces of, well, absolutely everything were scattered all over the place. Pieces of old robots, random scrap, even some guns and armor. anything you could imagine, sans suits of T-45 power armor. The last thing the town needed was for the Steel Rangers to come knocking down the door. I must admit, I was tempted to spend some of my earnings on the selection of weapons and armor she had. I had a simple set of leather barding strapped to my hide, protective but limited against anything substantial. And then there was the 9mm pistol strapped into its holster, a pea shooter by many standards. Though both were well maintained, my ability to keep things in peak condition is something I do pride myself on. And there at the counter, rising out of the junk, was the chirpy ghoul I was looking for. Ditzy was busy at work on a terminal, mismatched eyes narrowed as she tapped away with rotted hooves. Her skeletal wings seemed to twitch in irritation, and the Pegasus had yet to notice me. I coughed loudly into a hoof, the mare giving a rather small and cute sound of surprise. She stood bolt upright, blinking a few times as she looked toward me. And then she gave me that big, bright, goofy smile. Picking up a chalkboard beside her, she wrote, "Scrapper, got stuff for me?" Scrapper. That was a name very few called me, an alternative to Scrap Heap I was ultimately indifferent to. I was Scrap, one way or the other. Though if she got to use nicknames, so did I. "Full wagon load, Derpy," I stated to the ghoul, shooting her my best smirk. Bunch of parts from old sky wagons, a few busted weaponry, and some other stuff you'd find useful. Ditzy rubbed out the writing on the board, replacing it with, "Anything can be helpful. Show?" I gave her a nod, walking back out as she removed herself from behind the counter and fell into step behind me. As we exited absolutely everything, I motioned toward the wagon, and she gave a happy squeal at the haul. She batted her wings as she floated around the wagon, peering inside and giving every single piece a good looking over. Finally, she landed back on her hooves and trotted over with a chalkboard held in her mouth. The text stated, "Lots of stuff. I'll get caps." "I would hope so," I replied with a small chuckle. "I'll get my money and be right back to it. Still plenty of scrap to dig up." She nodded, beginning to trot back towards the shop. And then she paused, looking back at me with a small tilt to her head. I stopped too, wondering what had caught the mare's attention. But even as I looked, there was nothing of particular note that might have caught her interest. It was only as my confusion began to grow that I realized she was looking specifically at me, rather than something around my general area. Something the matter?" I asked, suddenly having an unexplained feeling of nervousness. She stared a little more before writing, "We'll get caps, but have other thing." Other thing? Just what was she talking about? She had never gotten this, weird in my previous visits to her business. Seriously, having those undead, milky eyes stare directly into yours is some creepy shit. And yet, with nothing but my general paranoia to ward me off, I followed her back inside as well as she went behind the counter to fetch the cap. All the while, I just watched the ghoul nervously as I tried to figure out the sudden change in attitude. Maybe it was whatever she was working on before I came in. "So, what were you doing on that terminal?" I asked as casually as possible. "Something interesting? Dangerous? What's the story?" She looked up at me, considering me for a moment before answering on her board. "Going Ponyville way tomorrow. Stuff I need to do." "Oh. And, what is this stuff?" She didn't answer right away, instead counting up the last of my caps and depositing them in a bag. She took hold of a rope and tied the bag shut before throwing it toward me. I caught it with my magic, putting my payment into my saddlebags. When I looked back, Ditzy had written, "Not related, I need you for a thing." "All right. A job then?" I asked, getting a nod in return. I assume there's scavenging involved. The tilted head I got conveyed the answer as being a maybe. Still, having an actual paying job was always better than scrounging around and hoping to break big with the next load. Seriously, what kind of trouble could this little ghoul get me in? All right, I'm listening. She gave me a happy smile, one that I couldn't help but get infected by the sheer cheeriness of it. Seriously, is there any way you could possibly not get a warm feeling in your stomach every time she gave you that bright smile? Impossible, I say. Impossible. As I smiled to myself like an idiot, she began to dig through the piles of junk around the shop as if searching for something very specific. She gave a few garbled hums as she went through it all, picking up pieces and discarding them to one side when they turned out not to be what she was looking for. This carried on for a while, and eventually I just sat in one corner while waiting as patiently as I could for her to find whatever this thing was. Finally, however, she gave a squeal of victory as she lifted something up in her hoof. Something that, when she presented it to me, I was forced to do a small double take. It was a device held together with a simple latch, one large enough to be attached to a pony's hoof and adjusted for comfort. It had a few little dials to the right of a green screen that dominated most of the device. It had a few dark, dead-looking lights dotted around and a detachable utility cable plugged into the back. She allowed me to lift it up in my magic, and for the first time in my life, I held a Pip-Buck. Where in Equestria did you get this? I asked, dumbfounded. These are worth a fortune in caps. Does it even work? Ditzy nodded, writing, "Yeah, powered, just off." I whistled, giving the Pip-Buck a look over. Wow. So, what do you want me to do with it? She considered for a moment before erasing her previous comment and getting to work writing a new one. It took a few moments, and when she turned the board around, I had to squint to see all the small writing. She had written a lot in such a small space. "Put it on, silly. It's a Model 3000 Mark IV. You don't need special tools to get it on and off. Picked it up from a trader who thought it busted. I got it working, and it's got something pretty interesting on it. It has a stable." I blinked. The Pip-Buck has a stable? She nodded happily, once again erasing what was on the board and replacing it with, "Yes, stable 84, location far north, hidden, untouched. Great scavenge if abandoned." "Unless it's got dwellers in it," I noted, getting another nod in return. I sighed. A stable, an unscavenged one, could be the biggest haul I would ever make in my life. The caps could set me up in 10-pony tower if I so wished. But there could be ponies still living in it, which would make it a complete waste of time. It was very much a matter of dwelling on the risks and rewards. But then, there was that sweet Pip-Buck to consider too. Not every day you got the chance to wear one of those little computers, now is it? Finally, I made up my mind. All right, sounds like something worth checking out. Ditzy clopped her hooves together in excitement, and at her beckoning, I undid the latch and the Pip-Buck and placed it onto my right hoof. The latch reattached as easily as it came undone, and I adjusted it so that it sat snugly against my hide without slipping off. Once it was firmly in place, I sat back on my haunches and brought my right hoof up so that I could see the screen. With a bit of searching, I found the button that seemed to turn on the power. Sure enough, the moment I pressed it, the whole screen lit up and began to display rolling green text as the operating system booted up. This went on for a few seconds before the text vanished, and a small colt in a stable jumpsuit flashed on the screen, giving me a cheeky little wink. Finally, the stable colt vanished. Once it was gone, the screen flashed to a representation of a pony with various bars attached to each limb. There were several other tabs to explore, including a map, inventory, and radio. I felt things shift around in my saddlebags, and, on examination, I realized that some kind of sorting spell from the device had rearranged my bags in an orderly fashion. Huh. Neat, I commented, shifting back to the status screen. When I did, I took note that an unfamiliar name was written out below the image of a pony. Before I could ask, Ditzy answered. "You can change the name. It's probably the original owner." "Ah, thanks," I replied, quickly going into the settings and doing just that. I gave a huff of satisfaction as my name replaced the original on the main screen, before I tried moving to one of the tabs I had yet to visit. That being the Objectives tab, curious as to what was logged inside the device. Locate Stable 84. I jumped back in surprise as an arrow appeared in my vision, pointing out of the store and into the magical land of Equestria beyond. It was then I also noticed other elements in my vision, namely a compass with a single green bar pointing towards where Ditzy was standing. And then, when I had jumped back in surprise, somehow I had made time stop. I was frozen in place, eyes wide as Ditzy seemed to glow a bright green. Percentage chances pointed towards all of her limbs. What the hell was this? I didn't want crazy percentages or weird targeting spells. Get out! Out! Time restarted, and I dropped to the floor. Ditzy just stared oddly at me. And then she started to laugh, or at least some mutilated attempt at laughter that came with being without a tongue. Calming herself, she picked up the board and conveyed to me EFS and SATS, I think. Red bad, green good. Flushing with embarrassment, I tried to ignore the demeaning incident of landing on my backside and instead searched the Pip-Buck for a better explanation. Apparently, the eyes forward sparkle would detect hostile intent around me as a cautionary measure. The Stable Tech arcane targeting spell was something that pretty much just stopped time and gave the user time to think. Freaky. Stable Tech had certainly come up with some advanced stuff, probably right up there with the old ministries themselves. I'd heard a few horror stories from around the wasteland, things from both before and after the world went boom. Believe me, I'd never go anywhere near that stuff for as long as I lived. Collecting myself, I got back to my hooves and tore my eyes away from the Pip-Buck. "Well, it's been great, Derpy," I stated, beginning to make my way toward the door. "If there's stuff to be had, I'll drag it all back here for a heap of caps." But my bravado was stopped by a squishy hoof on my shoulder, and with a small huff of irritation, I turned to once again face the ghoul and bear whatever catch she was about to lay on me. Her board read, "Stable needs code. Pip-Buck's code data is corrupted." I groaned, pinching the bridge of my muzzle with my hooves. Of course it is. All right, how do I get the code? She grabbed my foreleg, bringing the Pip-Buck up and shifting to the map screen despite my protests about personal space. She scrolled the map from the blip of New Appaloosa. How did a 200-year-old Pip-Buck even know the town? And settled the cursor on an apparently undiscovered blip of Manhattan. I looked towards her curiously. Manhattan? I have to go to the city? Why? And so the chalk was scraping along the board again. Nosed around. Guy in 10 Pony contacted. Claims to have code. Check it out. Look for Cobalt. Right. So now I was on a quest to find a lost mythical stable, and in the meantime, I had to go elsewhere to find a guy who may or may not have the code to said stable. Seemed legit. Okie dokie Loki, I muttered, freeing my foreleg and returning the Pip-Buck to its main screen. So head to Manhattan first. I can do that. A new objective appeared in my vision. It displayed the words, "Find Cobalt in 10 Pony Tower," quite clearly. I think I have everything I need then, I said, quite ready to get underway and find either my salvation or doom in this pre-war shelter of Ditzy's. Unless there's something else? Ditzy shook her head, signaling me that I was free to go. But before I could leave, I was stopped once again only this time by a really squishy hug of thanks from the overly enthusiastic Pegasus. And with me feeling thoroughly uncomfortable by the exchange, she made sure to write one last thing to me on the chalkboard. "Return with stable stuff, and I got caps and muffins for you." Heh, caps'll do fine, Derpy, I replied, finally making it out of the door. "See you when I see you." I gave a long sigh as I exited absolutely everything, glancing at the Pip-Buck on my leg. The EFS was picking up the movement of every pony in the town, something that would certainly come in handy in raider territory, particularly since I would have to pass through the area around Ponyville on the way. I'd rather avoid such bloodthirsty psychopaths if I could help it. After ensuring my delivered scrap was offloaded and added to the piles within, I hitched myself back up to the cart and pulled away from the shop toward the town's entrance. I had a long trip to Manhattan, and Stable 84 itself seemed to be located north of Canterlot in the expanse between the ruined capital and the frozen north. I just hoped the stable was ripe for the picking. But as I made that first step out of New Appaloosa, I made the mistake of thinking. Namely, I couldn't help but think about the Pip-Buck and where it had come from. Who was that person? And how does this kobold have the code for an old stable? That made my head hurt just thinking about it. I was never a fan of mysteries. And yet, think about it, I did. Who was this chrysalis that owned the Pip-Buck before me?